welcome to the webinar today. I am Junaid, and I want to welcome everybody to the webinar. Sorry, I said that twice. Heritage Ohio's mission is to help people save the places that matter, build community, live better. Today we will have a presentation on researching the history of your building. We'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please type it into the question box at any time, and we will answer them all at the end. Most issues with the webinar software will be solved if you close the program and restart it with the link that was sent to you. This webinar is approved for AIA HSW continuing education credits, so if you would like to receive credit for the webinar, I will be putting information in the chat box, and you can email me with your AIA number to receive credit. Our presenter today is Nathalie Wright. Nathalie is a historic preservation consultant based in Columbus, Ohio. Nathalie graduated from Michigan State University with a degree in art history and a specialization in historic preservation. With over 20 years of experience, she formerly worked at the State Historic Preservation Offices for Michigan and Ohio, as well as the Columbus Landmarks Foundation. Nathalie has written multiple National Register of Historic Places nominations for properties ranging in diversity from a 19th county children's home to early 20th century banks and hotels to mid-20th century Polynesian supper clubs. Supper club? Supper club, sorry. She co-authored the Zor Historic District, a 19th century utopian settlement nominated for listing as a National Historic Landmark. Nathalie has a particular interest in mid-20th century architecture and is dedicated to its preservation and documentation, including the recent historic designation of Irma Bombeck's house. She served as project manager for the Ohio Modern Dayton Area Survey, a large-scale model survey of recent past properties. And with that, I will hand this over to Nathalie.
Thank you, and thanks for being here, everyone out there in the invisible audience. All right, well, today we, again, are talking about researching and finding out the history of your old building. And in the amount of time that we have, I'm going to touch on the very basic and primary historic tools that we will use. So let's just get started. And I always start by looking at the county auditor's website when I'm researching a property. And every county is different with respect to the type of information or the level of detail or even the user friendliness of the website. But as you can see from this list, there are a number of clues that can be found on an auditor's website. The Franklin County Auditor's website here in Central Ohio has digitized property transfer records back to 1920. Now, I haven't encountered this with other counties, but this sort of detail on an auditor's website changes all the time. So it is definitely worthwhile to thoroughly explore an auditor's website and go back to it frequently if you're working within the same county. Deed records are normally found in the county recorder's office. Thus far, I haven't found a lot of digitized deed records that are easily searchable, but again, it's worth a phone call or investigating a website if you need that information, because again, online accessibility changes frequently. Now, one thing that's helpful, or that one is typically looking to start with, is when was the building constructed? And if you're looking at the list here, I have a note that the construction date that the auditor gives is not always accurate. You do need to use caution with the dates that they provide, especially with buildings from the 1800s or early 1900s. The dates are frequently incorrect. Sometimes an auditor will just give a generic date of 1900, and the building might actually be 10 or more years older or 10 or more years younger. I've also seen auditors simply list buildings as old, which is not very helpful because you already know it's old, right? So in that scenario, knowing architectural styles or building types or the era of use for certain specific materials, that is helpful, and that will help you to substantiate the auditor And basically what we're doing as we go through the presentation today with any of the resources is you're trying to find tidbits of information from lots of places to work your puzzle. So what we'll do is move on and talk about visual construction clues, which will aid in understanding a property's history. So briefly, we'll look at a couple of architectural styles and talk about building types. Architectural styles are about artistic expression, design details, applied ornament or lack thereof, and sometimes chosen materials. So here we see a Greek Revival building at Kenyon College on the right and a Greek Revival house on the left. In the Greek Revival style is defined by a temple front presentation, either with a complete pediment like we see here or with cornice returns that are on the house. The use of columns is also found in the Greek Revival, and we see that here on both buildings. And with the Greek Revival style, the columns are normally either, it's hard to see here in this photo, they're either Doric or Ionic capitals. Proportion and symmetry were also very important to this style, and I think you can easily see from both examples how they are very balanced and symmetrical. The Greek Revival style also had an overall heaviness compared to other styles of the time period. And you can see down here when the style was popular and where you would find it in Ohio, mostly in the Northeast, but sporadically in other parts of the state as areas were settled by New Englanders. But definitely the further south you go, you probably see a little less Greek Revival than if you're in Northeast Ohio. And then one final thought on this style is these two examples represent a variation or a subset of the Greek Revival known as in antis, where the porch and entrance are recessed behind two columns, which are then placed between two truncated or short wall segments, like we see on both buildings. And again, as you can see, these stylistic elements are the same for residential and non-residential buildings. So let's talk a little bit about architectural style versus building type. Here we see a Queen Anne house on the left. Queen Anne is an architectural style defined by asymmetry, juxtaposition of contrasting materials, towers or turrets on corners, bay or oriel windows like we see here. Whoops, sorry. Wraparound porches and sometimes abundant ornamentation. On the right we have a ranch house. Ranch houses are a building type, not a style. And they are defined by their configuration and by an overall sense of horizontality. They come in a variety of shapes, but are one-story houses with low-pitched roofs and an elongated quality. A key feature of the ranch house type is the attached garage, and we can see it here at the end of the house. And in this, sorry I keep hitting the mouse pad too hard. The garage in the floor plan down here, you can see where it's attached. So that's new for this for a house after World War II. Previous to that, the garage was in the back of the house. On the interior, ranch houses typically have an open floor plan with the living and dining rooms flowing together, and you can see that again in the diagram at the bottom right. Also, the kitchen was often moved forward to the front of the house, and that was new in the post-World War II era as well. So again, we're looking at a building type, and a ranch house can have different architectural stylistic elements applied to it, and a popular one for ranch houses was the Colonial Revival. Let's look at some more building types. And again, to define a building types are about shape or configuration. They're about floor plan arrangement, and often they are related to the function of the building. For example, up in the left corner, we have an agricultural outbuilding, and those are building types, not styles. and they are largely defined by function. But their shape sometimes evolved over the years. For example, older corn cribs from the 1800s in order were frame construction built in a rectangular configuration. But material advances in the 1900s introduced concrete and metal corn cribs that were round with a ventilated conical roof. In the middle, we see a different building type. Combination stations were a type of train depot that had a very specific floor plan and function. They were a combined freight and passenger station with a 3-room floor plan, which included a room for freight, a ticket office, and a passenger waiting room. The ticket office typically was on the track side of the building. We can see that right here. And they often projected outward from the plane of the building. Daylight factories were multi-story reinforced concrete frame buildings with large window spans enclosing an open, spacious grid of concrete columns on each floor of the interior. This building type dominated the American industrial landscape in the first 30 years of the 20th century. So there are 3 building types. Here are a couple more. And again, just a quick reminder that a building type can have many different styles. In the top, we see the Masonic Lodge building type. And on the left, it's expressed in the Italianate style, and on the right, in the Neoclassical Revival style. Again, on the bottom, the row house apartment building type. We have one without any real stylistic definition, and then one that's a combination of the Italianate and late Gothic Revival. There are a number of well-known books about architectural style, and here are a few examples. So again, I just touched on a couple of styles and a few building types. There's a lot to learn about architectural history and architectural styles. And there's more to understanding architectural style than just knowing the design details or what type of ornamentation it has. There are theories about design and theories historically about design and ornamentation evolved, often all of that happening in response to social or cultural issues of the time. So it is certainly more complex than just identifying certain features. This book, How to Complete the Ohio Historic Inventory, is one of my go-to books, and it is just an essential book to have if you're working in Ohio. It is an excellent resource for identifying styles and building types as well as architectural terminology. It won't tell you everything about the evolution of design theory, but it is very, very thorough, and obviously it's Ohio-centric, which is helpful. And this can be found for purchase from the Ohio History Connection. So moving on a little bit, materials and methods of construction, like styles and building types, can also have periods of popularity. The presence of specific materials can help to determine a rough date of construction. So one such example that we'll look at now is rock face concrete block, also known as molded, rusticated, ornamental, art blocks, or artificial stone. It had a lot of names. In a neighborhood constructed during the 1910s and 1920s, you will commonly find an abundant number of rock face concrete block foundations or porches. And occasionally you will see, as we have here in the example at the bottom, entire buildings constructed with these blocks. So again, rock face concrete block became a popular material in the early 20th century after a series of technological advances in the design of block-making machines. The machines created hollow blocks that were uniform in size and shape and had interchangeable faceplates, which could create varying designs. Interchangeable molds were also available, which allowed a block maker to create different types of molded concrete products, such as round porch columns. So in the bottom left here, you can see from this historic ad the variety of blocks, and then on the right there's a house shown here which I just happened to stumble upon, but really love the detail of it. It's very interesting and ornate, each of those blocks plus the smooth corner coins. And this house is in Danville, Ohio, and driving through there, this was the only house I saw like this with this specific block, but the small community had a pretty large number of rock-faced concrete block buildings, plus a lot of foundations and porches on frame buildings. And this begins to tell us just quickly, it's a visual clue to the era of growth and expansion of this village. So just quickly, by knowing when this material is popular, we can have a sense of what was happening within this community just by driving through. And then we'll look at one more example here. Again, knowing the dates of materials is helpful, and it's helpful for an individual property as well as the village example I just talked about. For example, this 1870s Italianate house has a porch with rock-faced concrete block walls. Also, the windows were changed from the standard 2/2 sash of the Italianate style to an early 20th century 1/1 sash. So these early 20th century physical changes may indicate an event or something significant happening with the property, such as a new level of prosperity for the farmstead or a change in ownership. All right, well, let's move on and talk a little bit about historic resources. For properties in rural areas or small villages, my first stop after the auditor's website is the county atlas. Ohio counties have at least one atlas, typically printed between the 1850s and the 1870s. Some counties have a second atlas, typically from the late 1880s or 1890s. County atlases will have a narrative history of the county and the individual townships, and usually mention of notable properties. You also might find historic renderings of select buildings from the county. And the atlases are especially helpful for small rural villages. Often the atlas map is the only historic representation of a settlement or village that you will find. The atlases also depict entire townships, providing contextual understanding of a village, city's location, landscape features, parcel ownership, and acreage. And here on the left is an 1875 map of Lawrence Township, and we can see two villages. Down here we see Zor, and up here Boulevard, and so we get the sense of how big the villages are and their shape at that time, their layout. We also see rivers cutting through the township right here, a river and tributaries. The Ohio and Erie Canal is depicted here as our roads coming through, these double lines, and the shaded areas along many of the tributaries are stone quarries. So we can learn a lot from these township maps. And looking at the one on the right, this detail map, again, we can see a lot of information about the landscape, including orchards, which are these squiggly things, and the location of springs. We also see parcel configuration and the ownership of the parcel and the number of acres included. Also, we can see the primary building on the parcel with the little black squares. And often institutional buildings like churches, as we see here, are shown, and schools. We have a schoolhouse down here. as well as cemeteries are denoted. So again, a lot can be seen from these maps and what was there historically and what may remain there today. For cities and mid-sized towns, city directories are a researcher's best friend. They contain an alphabetical listing of names, including businesses. Then beginning typically in the 19-teens, the city directories started providing a list of all streets and addresses, so you could look, they were cross-referenced. You could look up properties either way, either by owner name or by street address. Also, under the address where the occupant's name is given, especially for residential properties, it would have their occupation denoted and sometimes even the company that they worked for. Again, very helpful. In the advertisement section of the city directory, you often can find renderings of historic buildings such as this one from 1948. And then this photo shows a 1966 view of Newark's new high school, and some city directories will highlight an important property to the community and also provide a basic history of the community. All right, well, by now you might be wondering, where can I find a county atlas or city directories? Will the library come to you, or do you have to go to the library? So county atlases are nearly always available at the main branch of any local or regional library system. They are also available in most large archives, such as the Ohio History Connection or the State Library of Ohio. Finding, in my experience anyway, finding the county atlas, the entire thing, online is not typical. However, individual historic maps, such as the township maps we looked at, will sometimes pop up online, but they tend to be on paid or subscription websites, which may or may not serve you. Similarly, city directories are available in the respective local library system, and the Ohio History Connection has a pretty thorough collection for all Ohio cities. Few libraries have undertaken the massive task of scanning the city directories for their community. Cincinnati is one exception. The Cincinnati Public Library has a virtual library containing city directories from 1819 to 1941, and you could find that by searching for Cincinnati Virtual Library. But for most cities, one is going to have to journey to the library. I have seen reference that some city directories are available through the Library of Congress, but to be honest, I haven't explored with that very much. Being fortunate to live in a city where the physical book is pretty readily available, that tends to be my preference. The second best friend of the researcher is the Sanborn maps. The Sanborn Fire Insurance Map Company produced maps for Ohio cities and mid-sized towns from the 1870s through the mid-20th century. And you should note that some small villages often do not have a Sanborn map. But the Sanborn maps, especially in conjunction with the city directories, are just invaluable. You can learn so much. And they show entire blocks, they show streets and addresses and building footprints. They also provide details about the buildings, such as number of stories, construction materials, porches, and outbuildings. And just to look at the image here on the right, we have the Buxton Hotel, and this is telling us it's 2 stories. It's showing us a porch on the front. We, of course, see the whole configuration of the building. We can see 2 small 1-story additions on the back. We see outbuildings here, and the Sanborn map even tells us this one's for wood and this one's for coal. The buildings with X's through them are either carriage houses or later garages, auto garages. And looking at the building next door, this house next door, the D means dwelling. We see that it has a 2-story inset porch and a 1-story chunk on the back. Same thing with this one. Here we see it has more of a wraparound porch, a one-story porch, two-story building. We see the rear porch. So again, a lot of detail from these maps. Looking at this example, for large industrial buildings, the Sanborn will often be very descriptive about the construction materials and what functions were found in different parts of the building. In this example, the Delco factory in Dayton is noted as a fireproof constructed building with reinforced concrete, metal windows, and interior walls of gypsum block, all described down here. And then this little paragraph is telling us what is on each floor, from the raw stock housed in the basement to the machine shop on the second floor to a kitchen and drafting rooms on the 6th floor. This is very detailed, telling us a lot about the building. It's also telling us the location of elevators. It's giving us the date of construction. Sanborn maps will often do that for large industrial buildings or public buildings, and those dates tend to be pretty accurate. The map is also even telling us the location of fire escapes at that time. Again, a lot of detail and very helpful. All right, well, how do you find a Sanborn map? I generally just access them through the Columbus Library's website, but one could go straight to the Ohio Public Library Information Network's website, as we see here in the image on the right. And the address, the web address, is at the bottom of the screen here. And once you're logged in, you can enter a city name, and then the image on the right will come up, and you can view every map within that community as shown. Here it's telling us for Granville there are 27 maps. You could look at them individually, or you can come down to where it says all date ranges, click on that, and then you can search for a specific building or address. Some libraries will have their community's original Sanborn maps available. Because the original Sanborns are color-coded and the online versions are not, it is very helpful to see the original if possible. For example, this detail from a Cincinnati Sanborn shows that yellow represents frame construction, pink is brick, blue is stone, brown is fireproof, which normally means concrete. And so this tells us a couple of things. One, it tells us about the individual buildings that we're looking at, but we can also look at this comprehensively and see within a block or a neighborhood what is the predominant mode of construction. It gives us a little bit more information to go with to look at an area comprehensively. And Cincinnati's color-coded original Sanborns can be found at the virtual library I mentioned a couple slides ago. And the OSU library, the Ohio State University Library, used to have Sanborns on microfilm, and I believe that might still be the case, so that would be another clue for a place to go to do this kind of research. Now, moving on from mapping, another primary source to look at are county histories. And most Ohio counties had a county history published in the 1870s or 1880s. Sometimes smaller counties, like we see on the left with Wayne and Holmes, would be grouped into one book, but most counties had their own book. Also, historian Henry Howe traveled Ohio twice during the 19th century, writing a history of each county, and his works are well worth seeking out for a basic contextual understanding of a county or a larger community. And then some counties had a second history published in the early 20th century. Sometimes these later histories are a nearly verbatim repetition of the earlier one, but they'll also contain updated information. County histories are found at local libraries and archives, as you might guess, but more and more I'm seeing them pop up on the internet, which is very helpful. And then you can usually search within the book for whatever you're looking for in those cases. Like other things, finding them online is kind of inconsistent, but when you do, it is helpful. Newspaper articles obviously are a great primary source, and here are some examples of newspapers that I came across while researching these two respective buildings. And there are a number of ways to find archived newspaper articles. The Ohio Memory Project has a searchable collection of digitized newspapers. And underneath this image here on the left, you can see the web address for that. And the image on the right was something that I found on the Ohio Memory Project website for a different project. And the little pink squares are the highlights that come up showing you whatever word you search for, where it is on that page. So that's pretty helpful to have and not have to scan through the whole thing, the whole page. Makes it a little faster. And then many local newspapers have a searchable archive of articles. When I was working on a big project in Dayton, the Dayton Daily News had a free searchable archive. A lot of newspapers will charge a fee to use their archives. You might be able to search and it will tell you a date or give you a hit for whatever you're searching for, but then it won't let you access the article without paying for the subscription. Some of them will do like a 24-hour subscription. I had that in Cleveland with the Plain Dealer, or it might be some other scenario, but just to know, you might find it online, but it might not be free or viewable. Also, most local libraries will have often a newspaper index online for finding specific information in that community. I know here in Columbus, the library system has a newspaper index for searching for something in particular. But many of these online databases are not completely inclusive with respect to chronology. They might only go back to a certain date, so that is something to be aware of. Your property might not fall within the parameters of what is searchable online. And then, of course, back to the library, many of them will have their local newspaper on microfilm, and you can just go there and scan through microfilm pages, which can be fun or tedious depending on your perspective. And the Ohio History Connection also has a very extensive collection of Ohio newspapers on film. Depending on the property you are investigating, you may want to conduct census research. I haven't had to do a lot of that in recent years. Census research can be helpful and give you good information. For some properties, I think it's probably more helpful for residential properties. I haven't had to do a lot of this kind of research for a while, so I had to refresh my memory, and much of this now is online versus going to a library where it might be on microfilm. And it's searchable, which is certainly much easier. Heritage Quest and Family Search, the two shown at the bottom, do offer free searches for census data. Heritage Quest may require a local library card for access. It did when I used it. And then Ancestry.com, which probably most people listening in today have heard of that one, as it's definitely the dominant website for genealogical research, but it does require a paid subscription for extended use. And the census research will tell you the head of household, the family members' names, the occupation of the head of household or anyone else living there, give ages, location of birth, and basic information like that. All right, well, large communities or towns with a specialized industry often have booklets from the early 20th century, and these will have historic images and background information. And here are two examples that I've found in recent projects. The one on the left is from the Lancaster Board of Trade, and it had a nice historic image of the county infirmary, which I was doing research on, but it had a lot of great contextual information about the community in general. And then the example on the right is from New Lexington, Ohio, and centered around industry of that area. Again, great contextual information, and if you happen to be looking for information on an industrial property, that would be an amazing find. So those are two things to keep an eye out for. And then historic postcards. I think a lot of people don't mention these when they think about research, but a lot of archives will actually have a postcard collection. And certainly if you are online in Google Images or Yahoo or whatever search engine and you type in historic photo of such and such building, often a historic postcard will come up, which is awesome. Just one word of caution about historic postcards. Although they are a great resource for understanding a building's historic appearance, there can be a certain amount of artistic license, especially with the ones like this one in the upper right or the one in the middle. The ones that are more of the linen type finish are often more of a rendering or a painting, and so there could be a certain amount of artistic license versus a postcard like the one in the upper left, which is an actual photograph. Just a word of caution, but those are certainly great resources. Now moving on, we'll talk just a little bit about secondary resources. The National Register of Historic Places nominations have become more and more scholarly over the past 2 decades, and they are a wealth of information, and they can be found or obtained from the State Historic Preservation Office. And the State Historic Preservation Office is a division of the Ohio History Connection. Also, National Historic Landmark nominations, many of them, especially recent ones, but increasingly more of the older ones, can be viewed and downloaded online from the National Park Service's website. Shown here in this image on the left is a master's thesis about daylight factories, which we looked at earlier in the presentation. That was extremely helpful in my research. PhD dissertations are also extremely helpful and can give you a lot of valuable in-depth information about a community or a specific building. These types of papers can be found in library collections. I've had them pop up online when I'm doing research for something specific, so you can get to them from a variety of ways, but they are definitely something to keep an eye out for. And then I'm sure you've seen them around, the books from Arcadia Publishing, the Images of America series, also the History Press. They've published history books on topics, neighborhoods, and communities across Ohio. And obviously there are other publishers putting out history books throughout the state, but these two can be seen in lots of places and are very plentiful. And again, are going to contain a lot of historic images and basic contextual information. There are numerous small, medium, and large size archives located across Ohio. They contain an amazing amount of material. I've mentioned the Ohio History Connection several times now, It is located here in Columbus. It contains a large archives and library, as well as the State Historic Preservation Office. Both of these divisions, if you want to see what they have online, you can get to them from ohiohistory.org. And just a sample or an example of something I found recently while researching at the Ohio History Connection in the archives. The two images on the left are original annual reports from the Fairfield County Infirmary, dating to the reports dated to the late 1800s and early 1900s. And they were prepared by the infirmary directors, and reports contained everything from the number of occupants at the facility, including the number of insane people, the number of inmate deaths, also talked about property maintenance and new construction. It gave suggested improvements that the infirmary directors recommended to the county commissioners, and so that was really fun to dig through and look at that information. Also, and then the State Historic Preservation Office, I already mentioned the National Register files being maintained there, but that office also has the Ohio Historic Inventory, which is an ongoing survey of properties 50 years and older. They have comprehensive survey reports and community preservation plans, and all of those files are open to the public, and you can go there during business hours and review whatever you'd like to review. Also, the Ohio History Connection has webinars and workshops related to genealogy and researching historic properties, and when I was in there the other day, I saw one about online newspaper research coming up in a couple weeks, I think on the 12th. Probably can find that on their website, I'm sure. Also, local libraries. Most library systems will have a local history room, and many libraries will also do similar types of trainings and workshops. And then another tip is that historical societies and libraries often have subject files that are very useful, and they're not typically denoted within the catalog. It's just the sort of thing where you would want to talk to someone who works there, talk to a librarian or an archivist to see if they have something like that. And you never know what you're going to find in a subject file. So I want to talk for a minute about the mid-20th century. There are a lot of opportunities to learn new things from that era. The era is underdocumented, but it has a lot to teach us about the evolution of architectural history, styles, building types, and the built environment in general. In the recent past, if you're studying it, also presents an opportunity to talk to architects or builders from the era. As part of the team working on the Ohio Modern Dayton Area Survey, I interviewed builders involved with the construction of all those ubiquitous ranch houses, as well as other building types. And the interviews were really fascinating, and they yielded a great amount of information about construction techniques, materials, marketing and advertising, floor plans, and overall suburban development. So there were a couple of interesting themes that came up during those interviews. One was that the era gave rise to home builders associations in the early 1940s. Previous to that, those types of associations didn't exist. And they're essentially lobbying groups, and there's even one at the national level lobbying Congress on behalf of the industry. So I found that pretty fascinating that, that the builder in the mid-century era was more prominent than in earlier decades in the U.S. with respect to residential construction, and that it was becoming a more comprehensive industry that they felt required organization at that level. So that was something that was interesting coming to light through the interviews. The other thing that was interesting was labor unions. And so we interviewed, I think, a half a dozen builders, and they all talked about interaction with the labor unions, and even the fact that they received pressure from the labor unions, especially for the builders doing non-residential construction. So many of them were visited by representatives from the unions and who were inquiring as to why they were not using unionized labor. So some of the builders kind of got around this, or they appeased the unions by hiring a unionized subcontractor, or they would emphasize that their laborers were only for their family business and that they would not be constructing other buildings for other firms. One builder talked about his company's workers voting down unionization. And so this all was really a big deal of the era, and I think something we don't think about so much now, perhaps. And then there was one builder, he recalled that, and this was his quote, "The union did attempt to force itself into the firm during the 1950s, but my father stood up to them." So this was obviously a contentious thing at the time. And then the third theme that kind of came up among the interviews with the builders and some interviews with developers for other projects I've done was that there's, I don't know, I've gotten a sense of a suburban Wild West among these interviewees. And one builder, kind of off the record, mentioned a gun being shown during one of these intense labor union visits. Another builder talked about naming the subdivisions and naming the streets, and said that those names were often created after a few rounds of booze while they were standing around the bulldozer. A lot of era developers became pilots, scouting out undeveloped acreage from above, and a lot of them talked about flying down to Miami for long party weekends. So sort of the backstories that you wouldn't get without being able to do the oral history interviews, and so an advantage of doing research from that era. So I'll kind of wind it down here a little bit with some concluding thoughts. So if you watch History Detectives or one of those celebrity genealogy shows, historic research will seem fast and easy. You know, you always find the information you need in a half hour. But it takes a lot of time to be thorough, and you might not find all the evidence that you're hoping to locate. For example, it is often very difficult to identify an architect for a building, which I still find surprising after all these years, but it is true. And certainly, historic research is not rocket science, but it does take patience and an experienced eye. And the goal is you want to bring the building story to life, so you might need to place it into a historic context that highlights its relevance in a bigger picture beyond just telling the story of that building itself. You might need to think about the building beyond just the basic history or facts of it in order to bring it to life for a different audience. So aside from documenting a property's unknown history, I think the main objective of research and undertaking that endeavor is to enjoy the process. It can be tedious. It can also be fun and rewarding. Well, you've probably noticed my bias for going to the library. I was a book hugger long before I was a building hugger. And much can be found online, but it is wise to not solely rely on the internet for historic research. The reality is that different facilities have different resources. There is not one magical place that will have everything to tell your building's story. And besides, once you get out on the road, you never know what strange and interesting things you'll see. Thank you.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please type it into the question box at this time. We do have one. Mary Keene had commented earlier in the presentation that I would think weather would also play a part in some of the styles, cold winters versus southern climates. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, yes, that could be true. I think probably materials would factor into that as much as or more than style. I'm trying to think of a good example. That's an interesting question, and I didn't anticipate it. You know, if you think about the Southwest or California, you'll have a lot more of the Mediterranean revival style, or even in Florida, than you have up here in this part of the country. But that style uses a lot of stucco as part of its material expression of the style. And stucco, of course, is not going to be as durable in this climate as it is in a warmer climate. So that's one example of where a style or the materials associated with the style would factor into the prevalence of that style in a certain region.
Sorry. This is such a fascinating subject. This is Frank from Heritage, Ohio, and I'm just horning in on Nathalie's webinar. But one of the interesting things about environment and weather is that it might not affect the style that someone chose to build a structure in, but it could affect how that building was laid out or the openings that were decided on. Like you might have a Greek Revival building that you really look at symmetry as being an important piece of how that building looks from the outside. But on the northern exposure, you may only have 2 bays of windows. On the southern exposure, you may have 4 bays of windows. And so I guess you surmise that it was an environmental or from an environmental viewpoint, where when you have cold winter winds coming out of the north, you didn't want as many openings on the north side of a building as you wanted on the south side of a building. So that's one of the interesting things that I've found when doing research. Any other questions? No? Any parting pieces of advice, Nathalie?
Nope, just have fun and enjoy it.
Well, thank you, Nathalie, for joining us. Happy Preservation Month to everyone. It is May, and I'd like to invite you all to join us next week for our next weekly webinar. We will have Dave Mertz from Belmont College talking about building pathology. So we're going to see the good, the bad, and the ugly of what happens to buildings. And hopefully Dave will also supply us with some common sense solutions to help figure out how to turn those bads and uglies into more of the goods. However, I do want to say that this Saturday we also have our Old House Fair coming up in Medina. So I'd like to invite anyone in the area Saturday morning to head to Medina and join us. We have a plethora of sessions, probably 15 different sessions happening over the course of the day. So whether the topic is paint or whether it's refinishing your hardwood floors or how to restore wood or steel windows or getting a great preservation pep talk from Bernice Radel, we are going to have something, I think, for everyone. So I'd really like to invite you to join us. You can buy tickets online, go to heritageohio.org, or you can just buy tickets at the door, as it were, Saturday morning. So I see, what time is the next webinar, I think. It's going to be 1 p.m., Pearl, next week. So yes, join us the same time, same day, same place online, and we will...
Maybe not same day. I think with the webinar... Yeah, no, it is same time, same day.
Okay, so we'll see you May 10th at 1 p.m. for our next webinar. Otherwise, have a great day. We'll talk to you soon.